I never expected a simple joke at a family dinner to reveal how little my daughter-in-law truly thought of me. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and at 68 years old, I thought I understood the people sitting around my family's dinner table. I believe that after a lifetime of raising a son, supporting a husband, teaching generations of students, and showing up whenever my family needed me, I had earned at least a small measure of respect. Looking back now, I realize respect is not something you assume exists. Sometimes, it takes one careless moment to show you the truth. The dinner was held on a warm Saturday evening in late June. Ethan and Brittany had invited everyone to their home for what was supposed to be a casual family gathering. Their house sat in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, with neatly trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes stretching down the street. I arrived 15 minutes early, carrying a homemade apple pie and a large bowl of potato salad prepared from a recipe my mother taught me over 50 years ago. Family dinners had always mattered to me. They were one of the few traditions I refused to let disappear. As I walked up the front steps, I could already hear laughter coming from inside. Brittany opened the door with a bright smile that seemed genuine enough. "Margaret, you made it," she said. "Of course," I replied, holding up the pie. "I brought dessert." She glanced at the pie and smiled. "You always do." At the time, the comment sounded harmless. Later, I would remember it differently. The dining room looked beautiful. Fresh flowers sat in the center of the table. Candles flickered softly. My granddaughter Lily was helping set out silverware, while my grandson Mason chased the family dog through the living room. For a little while, everything felt normal, comfortable, familiar. The kind of evening that reminds you why family matters. We sat down just after 6 o'clock. Plates were passed around. Conversations overlapped. Someone talked about summer vacation plans. Someone else discussed rising grocery prices. I listened more than I spoke, enjoying the simple comfort of being surrounded by people I loved. Then, it happened. It started with one of Brittany's friends asking who had brought the pie. Brittany laughed before taking a sip of wine. "That would be Margaret," she said. "If there's free food involved, you can always count on her showing up." The table laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough. I smiled politely. The kind of smile women my age learn to wear when something stings more than we want to admit. Brittany continued. "Honestly, she's like a professional guest. Every family event, every holiday, every barbecue. She never misses a chance for a free meal." More laughter followed. Ethan chuckled softly. My smile remained in place, but something inside me shifted. I looked down at my plate. The mashed potatoes suddenly seemed very interesting. The candles reflected softly against the polished table surface. Nobody noticed that I stopped eating. Nobody except one person. Across the table sat a man I barely knew. His name was Daniel Harper, a neighbor of Ethan and Brittany's. He had been invited along with several other guests. While everyone else laughed, Daniel didn't. Instead, he glanced toward me with an expression I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't pity. It wasn't discomfort. It was something closer to concern. Brittany kept talking. The conversation moved on. New topics replaced old ones. The laughter faded. But I noticed Daniel watching quietly from time to time throughout the evening. As the dinner finally came to an end and guests began gathering their belongings, I slipped outside onto the front porch for a moment of fresh air. The evening sky was painted with shades of orange and gold. I stood there alone, listening to distant cicadas and wondering why a simple joke felt heavier than it should have. A few moments later, the front door opened behind me. Footsteps approached. I turned and saw Daniel standing there. He hesitated before speaking. Then he looked directly at me and asked a question that would change everything. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "do you know what Brittany says about you when you're not around?" For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. The sounds of the gathering drifted through the screen door behind us. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed. A chair scraped across the hardwood floor. Normal sounds from a normal evening. Yet Daniel's question hung in the warm summer air like something heavy and impossible to ignore. I looked at him carefully. He seemed uncomfortable, as though he was debating whether he should have said anything at all. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. Daniel slipped his hands into his pockets and glanced toward the house. "I am sorry," he said. "Maybe it is not my place." I waited. After nearly 7 decades of life, I had learned that silence often reveals more than pressure ever could. Finally, he exhaled. "I have been to several dinners here over the last couple of years. Brittany talks about you sometimes when you are not around. I felt a tightening in my chest, and his expression softened. She makes people think you are constantly asking Ethan for money, that you depend on them for everything, that you show up because you are lonely and have nowhere else to go. For a second, I simply stared at him. Then I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so absurd. I owned my own home. My mortgage had been paid off for nearly 20 years. My retirement savings were comfortable. I had spent 38 years teaching history at a public high school and another 8 years tutoring students after retirement. The idea that I depended on anyone financially was ridiculous. Yet as the laughter faded, another feeling took its place. Confusion. Why would she say that? I asked. Daniel shook his head. I do not know. But people believe her. Those 4 words stayed with me long after I drove home that night. People believe her. My little white house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac lined with maple trees. I had lived there since Ethan was 11 years old. Every room carried memories. Every picture frame held a chapter of my life. Usually the house felt comforting when I returned from family gatherings. That night it felt unusually quiet. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and stood there for several minutes without turning on any lights. Daniel's words kept replaying in my mind. People believe her. I walked into the living room and lowered myself into my favorite chair beside the window. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily. Outside, porch lights glowed across neighboring houses. Everything seemed peaceful, yet my thoughts would not settle. I began remembering small moments from the past few years. Moments I had dismissed at the time. A Christmas party where a distant cousin jokingly asked whether Ethan was still helping me with bills. A birthday gathering where someone complimented Brittany for taking such good care of me financially. A barbecue where a neighbor casually asked whether I planned to move in with Ethan someday. At the time, I had laughed off every comment. I assumed people were simply making conversation. Now those memories felt different. Connected. Like puzzle pieces that suddenly belonged to the same picture. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text message from Lily, my 16-year-old granddaughter. Grandma, thank you for coming tonight. I love you. The message brought a smile to my face. Lily had always been thoughtful. Even as a little girl, she noticed things other people missed. I typed back a quick response and set the phone down. A moment later, another message appeared. This one surprised me. Grandma, can I ask you something? I stared at the screen. Then another message arrived before I could answer. Has Brittany always told people that Grandpa left you with debt? My heart skipped. I looked at the words again. Then a third message appeared. Because that is what she tells everyone. I did not answer Lily immediately. Instead, I sat there staring at the glowing screen in my dark living room while the grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. It felt as though every second was carrying another piece of the truth toward me. My husband, Robert, had passed away 9 years earlier. He had been a careful man with money. Organized. Practical. The kind of person who kept records for everything. When he died, he left me financially secure. Not wealthy, but comfortable. We had planned carefully for retirement. There had never been debt. Not then. Not now. Yet according to Lily, Brittany had been telling people an entirely different story. I finally typed back. What exactly have you heard? 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. I could almost picture Lily sitting on her bed, trying to decide how much she should say. Her next message arrived a few moments later. People think Dad helps pay your property taxes. Some think he sends money every month. Some think you are struggling financially. I felt my stomach tighten. The strange comments over the years suddenly made sense. None of those people had reached those conclusions on their own. Someone had planted those ideas. Carefully. Repeatedly. Quietly. Another message appeared. Grandma, I thought everyone knew that was not true. I am sorry. I never realized they believed it. I thanked her and told her not to worry. Then I placed the phone face down on the table and sat silently for a long time. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window while coffee brewed in the machine Robert and I had purchased nearly 15 years ago. Normally, mornings brought me peace. That morning brought questions. I opened an old filing cabinet in my home office. Inside were decades of documents. Tax returns, insurance records, retirement statements, property records. I was not looking for proof. I already knew the truth. What I wanted was perspective. I wanted to understand how long this narrative had existed without my knowledge. As I sorted through papers, memories surfaced one after another. 5 years ago, Brittany had insisted on paying for dinner at a restaurant during Ethan's birthday celebration. When I offered to contribute, she had smiled and said loudly, "Do not worry, Margaret. We know things are tight right now." Everyone at the table had nodded sympathetically. At the time, I had assumed she was making an awkward joke. 4 years ago, during a neighborhood gathering, someone had praised Ethan for supporting his mother after Robert's passing. Ethan looked confused but said nothing. Brittany quickly changed the subject. 3 years ago, one of Ethan's co-workers had asked whether I was considering downsizing because maintaining a home alone must be expensive. Again, I thought nothing of it. Looking back now, I realized these were not isolated moments. They were pieces of a larger story being repeated over and over until people accepted it as fact. Around noon, I decided to call Ethan. My finger hovered over his contact information for several seconds before I pressed the button. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, Mom." His voice sounded cheerful, relaxed, normal. For a moment, I almost abandoned the conversation entirely. Then I remembered Daniel's question. I remembered Lily's messages. "Ethan," I said carefully, "do people think you support me financially?" Silence followed. Not long, just long enough. "Where did that come from?" he finally asked. I stared out the kitchen window at the maple tree swaying gently in the breeze. "Just answer me." Another pause. This one lasted longer. And in that silence, before he even spoke, I already knew something was very wrong. The silence on the phone stretched just long enough to tell me more than any answer could have. I sat at my kitchen table with one hand wrapped around a mug of coffee that had already gone cold. Outside, a pair of robins hopped across the lawn, completely unaware that my understanding of my own family was beginning to shift. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. "Mom, I think there has been some misunderstanding." It was not an answer. It was an escape route. I had heard that tone before. As a teacher, I had spent decades listening to students search for ways around uncomfortable truths. "Do people believe you support me financially?" I repeated. Another pause followed. "Some people might think that," he admitted. My chest tightened. Why would they think that? This time his hesitation lasted even longer. Brittany may have mentioned a few things over the years. A few things. Such small words for something that suddenly felt enormous. I closed my eyes briefly. Things that are not true. Ethan sighed. "Mom, she never meant any harm." I almost laughed at that. It was remarkable how often people defended harmful behavior by focusing on intentions rather than results. That was not my question. The line remained quiet. Then Ethan said something. That surprised me. "I honestly thought you knew." I opened my eyes. "Knew what?" "That Brittany tells people we help out occasionally." The room seemed to grow very still around me. The clock on the wall ticked softly. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a lawn mower started in the distance. Ordinary sounds. An ordinary afternoon. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. Occasionally, I asked carefully, "Ethan, people think I cannot afford my own bills." He did not respond immediately. I guess it got exaggerated. Exaggerated. Another convenient word. I thanked him for his time and ended the call before frustration could creep into my voice. Afterward, I remained seated for several minutes, staring at the family photographs displayed across my living room bookshelf. There was Ethan at age 10 holding a Little League trophy. Ethan at 18 wearing his high school graduation gown. Ethan standing beside Brittany on their wedding day. I studied each image carefully. Somewhere along the way, my son had become someone who accepted lies about his own mother because correcting them would have been inconvenient. That realization hurt far more than Brittany's comments ever could. Later that afternoon, I drove to the local cafe where I met my friend Susan every Thursday. We had known each other for nearly 30 years. If anyone would tell me the truth without sugarcoating it, it was Susan. The cafe smelled of fresh coffee and cinnamon pastries. Sunlight streamed through large front windows while customers worked quietly on laptops or chatted over lunch. Susan arrived carrying her usual iced tea. The moment she sat down, she studied my face. "Something is bothering you." I smiled faintly. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to people who know you." I told her everything. The dinner, Daniel's question, Lily's messages, my conversation with Ethan. Susan listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, she stirred her drink slowly. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Have you ever wondered why some people treat you differently when Brittany is around?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" Susan leaned back slightly. About 2 years ago. I attended that charity luncheon your daughter-in-law organized. I nodded. I remembered it well. Brittany had spent months planning the event. Several women were discussing how generous Ethan was for taking care of you financially. They spoke as though it was common knowledge. My stomach sank. Susan continued. I corrected them immediately. I told them you were financially independent. They seemed surprised. I stared at her. Why did you never tell me? She looked genuinely regretful. Because I assumed you already knew what Brittany was saying. For the second time in less than 24 hours, someone had spoken those exact words. I thought you knew. As I drove home later that evening, one realization became impossible to ignore. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not a careless joke. It was not a few comments taken out of context. It was a story that had been carefully repeated for years. And somehow, I was the only person who had never heard it. That night, I could not stop thinking about a single question. Why? Why would Brittany spend years convincing people that I was dependent on my son when the truth was so easy to verify? The lie did not benefit me. It did not benefit Ethan. Yet somehow it benefited her. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that the answer was hiding somewhere beneath the surface. The following morning, I decided to stop guessing and start paying attention. For years, I had dismissed small inconsistencies because I valued peace. Now I began reviewing them with fresh eyes. I opened old photo albums stored in my hallway closet. Family gatherings, holiday dinners, birthday celebrations. At first, I was simply looking through memories. Then patterns began to emerge. In nearly every photograph Brittany posted online, there was a carefully crafted story attached to it. A caption about family. A caption about generosity. A caption about sacrifice. Curious, I opened my social media account and searched through years of public posts. What I found was unsettling. There were dozens of photos featuring me. Me holding Christmas gifts. Me sitting at Thanksgiving dinners. Me standing beside Ethan and the grandchildren. Individually, none of the captions seemed alarming. Together, they painted a very specific picture. So grateful Ethan always takes care of everyone. Family means helping those who need it most. Proud of my husband for carrying so many responsibilities. The comments underneath were even more revealing. People constantly praised Ethan for supporting his mother. Some called him selfless. Others called him generous. One woman even wrote, "It is wonderful that Margaret has you to rely on." Brittany had replied with a heart emoji. Nothing more. She never directly confirmed the assumption. She never corrected it either. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. It was clever. Extremely clever. She rarely lied outright. Instead, she created a narrative and allowed other people to reach the conclusion she wanted. Around lunchtime, my phone rang. It was Lily. "Grandma, are you busy?" she asked. Not at all. Her voice sounded nervous. "Can I tell you something?" I immediately sat up straighter. Of course. She hesitated. I probably should have said something years ago. My stomach tightened. About what? Mom talks differently when you are not around. I remained silent. Lily continued. "She always says she is worried about you. She tells people you cannot manage things by yourself. She acts like she is protecting you." I looked out the window toward my backyard garden. The roses were blooming beautifully. Robert had planted most of them himself. "And what do you think?" I asked softly. Lily answered without hesitation. "I think she likes being seen as the hero." The simplicity of the statement struck me. Not because it was dramatic, because it made sense. Every story Brittany told placed her and Ethan in the role of rescuers. The generous couple helping an aging mother. The responsible family carrying extra burdens. The admired people making sacrifices. Meanwhile, my actual accomplishments disappeared quietly into the background. By the end of the conversation, Lily had shared several examples from recent years. Small comments. Casual remarks. Subtle exaggerations. None of them seemed important alone. Together, they formed a clear pattern. After we hung up, I walked into my home office and opened a notebook. For the first time, I began writing everything down. Dates. Conversations. Names. Memories. I was no longer trying to understand whether something was happening. I already knew it was. What I needed to discover now was how far the story had spread. As I wrote, a notification appeared on my phone. A message from someone I had not heard from in nearly 3 years. Daniel Harper. His message contained only one sentence. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think there is something else you deserve to know." For several seconds, I stared at Daniel's message without replying. The late afternoon sun stretched across my desk, illuminating the notebook where I had begun documenting everything I could remember. Names, dates, conversations, patterns. What had started as confusion was becoming something much clearer. I finally typed back, "What is it?" His response came almost immediately. "It is easier to explain in person. Are you available tomorrow morning?" The next day, we met at a small cafe near the downtown library. It was quiet, the kind of place where retired people read newspapers and college students worked on assignments. Daniel arrived carrying a folder. The sight of it immediately made me uneasy. After ordering coffee, we sat near a window overlooking the street. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel slid the folder across the table. "Before you look at this," he said carefully, "I need you to understand something. I never intended to get involved." I nodded. "I appreciate your honesty." He looked relieved. A lot of people genuinely believe the story Brittany tells. Most of them are not trying to be cruel. They think they are admiring Ethan and Brittany for being generous. Slowly, I opened the folder. Inside were several printed pages, screenshots, social media posts, community event newsletters, charity announcements. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Then I started reading more closely. My stomach tightened. In multiple community newsletters, Brittany had been publicly recognized for helping support elderly family members. In one article, she was described as someone who balanced raising children while also caring for an aging parent. The aging parent was clearly me. Another community post praised Ethan and Brittany for providing financial assistance to family. Again, the implication pointed directly toward me. I looked up. "People actually believe this?" Daniel nodded. "More than you realize." I continued turning pages. Every example followed the same pattern. Brittany never made direct false statements. Instead, she carefully positioned herself in situations where others would draw certain conclusions. Then she allowed those assumptions to spread naturally. It was subtle, calculated, effective. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. "Because there is something else." He reached into the folder and removed one final sheet of paper. Unlike the others, this was not public. It appeared to be a planning document for a local charity fundraiser. My eyes moved across the page until I reached a highlighted section. There, under a list of potential speakers, was my name. Beside it was a handwritten note. "Margaret Whitmore. Personal story about overcoming financial hardship after husband's death." I stared at the words. "I never agreed to this." "I know," Daniel replied. "The event committee assumed you had." My pulse quickened. "Who submitted my name?" His expression answered before his words did. "Brittany." I looked back down at the page. Suddenly everything made sense. The narrative was no longer limited to family gatherings or casual conversations. It had expanded into public spaces, community organizations, social circles, charity events. An entire image had been created around me without my knowledge. Not because anyone had asked for the truth, because the story was useful. I carefully closed the folder. For several moments, I simply sat there, watching people pass outside the cafe window. Then I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since this began. Does Ethan know how far this has gone? Daniel leaned back slowly. "I do not know," he admitted. "But I think there is someone who does." "Who?" Daniel's expression turned serious. "Your daughter-in-law's closest friend. And from what she told me last week, she is starting to feel guilty." The drive home felt different that afternoon. Not because I had discovered something new, but because the pieces were finally beginning to fit together. For days, I had been asking what Brittany was saying. Now I was starting to understand why she had been saying it. She had built a reputation around being admired. The devoted wife. The generous daughter-in-law. The woman who carried responsibilities with grace. And every good story needs a supporting character. In hers, I had become the struggling widow who needed saving. 2 days later, Daniel called. "She agreed to meet you," he said. I immediately knew who he meant. Brittany's friend. The one who supposedly knew more than she was comfortable admitting. We arranged to meet at a quiet park on the edge of town. It was a warm afternoon. Children played near the swings while older couples walked shaded paths beneath large oak trees. I arrived early and sat on a bench overlooking a small pond. 20 minutes later, a woman approached. She appeared to be in her early 40s, professionally dressed, carrying a tote bag over one shoulder. "Margaret?" she asked. I stood and offered a polite smile. "You must be Rebecca." She nodded. For a moment, she looked as though she wanted to leave. Then she sat beside me. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, she exhaled. I owe you an apology. I remained silent. I should have said something years ago. There was genuine regret in her voice. Not dramatic. Not rehearsed. Just honest. Tell me what happened, I said quietly. Rebecca looked down at her hands. When Brittany and I first became friends, she talked about you constantly. At first, it sounded harmless. She would complain about family obligations. She would joke about having to include you in holiday plans. Normal things. I listened carefully. Then the story started changing. She paused. She began describing you as fragile, dependent, financially overwhelmed. She said Ethan worried about you all the time. I felt a familiar heaviness settle in my chest. Rebecca continued. The strange part was how often she brought it up. It became part of her identity. Every conversation somehow returned to how much she and Ethan sacrificed. I stared across the pond where sunlight reflected off the water. Did anyone question her? Rebecca gave a sad smile. Most people did not. She sounded believable. That answer hurt more than I expected. Not because strangers believe the story, because it reminded me how easy it is for perception to become reality when repeated often enough. Then Rebecca said something that made me sit perfectly still. About 6 months ago, someone actually corrected her. I turned toward her. Who? A woman from a local community board. She mentioned that you were financially secure and owned your home outright. Rebecca hesitated. Brittany was furious afterward. Furious, not because the information was wrong, because she said people would stop understanding everything she had done for the family. The words lingered between us. Suddenly, the entire situation became clearer than ever. This was never about helping me. It was never about concern. It was about recognition, admiration, status. Rebecca reached into her tote bag and removed a small envelope. I brought these because I think you deserve to see them. Inside were printed messages, conversations, comments exchanged in private group chats over several years. I only glanced at the first page before realizing something important. For the first time since this began, I was holding evidence that could not be explained away as misunderstanding. I took the envelope home, but did not open it immediately. Instead, I placed it on my dining room table and stared at it from across the room for nearly an hour. The late afternoon sunlight slowly moved across the hardwood floor while the envelope remained exactly where I had left it. For years, I had accepted uncertainty. Now I was holding something different. Proof. Eventually, I sat down and carefully removed the documents inside. There were printed screenshots from private conversations spanning several years. The names had been partially obscured, but the context was unmistakable. Brittany had repeatedly described me as financially dependent. She joked about having to manage me. She complained about the burden of including me in family events. Most disturbing of all, she frequently accepted praise for sacrifices that had never existed. One message stopped me cold. A woman had written, "I do not know how you do it. Supporting your husband's mother while raising children must be exhausting." Brittany responded, "Some days are harder than others, but family comes first." I read the sentence 3 times. Family comes first. The irony was almost painful. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. For a long moment, I simply listened to the quiet house around me. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the distant sound of traffic outside. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. The next several days passed quietly. I did not call Ethan. I did not contact Brittany. I did not confront anyone. Instead, I organized everything. Screenshots, community newsletters, public posts, notes from conversations. The evidence formed a clear timeline stretching back nearly 6 years. The more organized it became, the calmer I felt. Anger requires uncertainty. Clarity creates something else entirely. The following week, Lily called with unexpected news. "Grandma, are you coming to Dad's birthday dinner next Saturday?" I had almost forgotten about it. Every year, Ethan hosted a large gathering with family, friends, co-workers, and neighbors. Nearly everyone who mattered in his social circle would be there. "I suppose so," I replied. Lily hesitated. "Mama's been talking about it nonstop." I smiled faintly. "That sounds like Brittany." "There is something else," Lily said. "She keeps mentioning how important family recognition is this year." After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. Family recognition. The phrase lingered in my thoughts. By Thursday, invitations and event details were appearing all over social media. Brittany had organized everything. Decorations, catering, seating arrangements, speeches. The entire evening seemed designed to celebrate Ethan's success and generosity. Looking through the posts, I noticed something interesting. One announcement described a special moment honoring the people who had supported Ethan's journey. Another mentioned family. Sacrifice. The familiar narrative was already taking shape. On Friday afternoon, Daniel called. "I heard about the party," he said. "A lot of people from the community will be there." "I know." There was a pause. "What are you planning to do?" I looked down at the neatly organized folder resting on my desk. Every document was arranged in chronological order. Every statement supported by evidence. Every assumption replaced by facts. "Nothing dramatic," I said. Daniel laughed softly. "For some reason, that answer worries me more." After we hung up, I walked to the window overlooking my backyard. The roses Robert planted years ago were blooming beautifully. Strong, quiet, unapologetic. For the first time since this began, I felt completely at peace. Brittany believed she controlled the story. Most people did. They expected me to remain silent because I always had. What none of them understood was that silence and weakness are not the same thing. And in less than 24 hours, an entire room full of people was about to learn the difference. Saturday evening arrived warm and clear. By the time I pulled into Ethan's driveway, the house was already full. Cars lined both sides of the street. Music drifted from the backyard. Laughter floated through the open windows. It looked exactly like the kind of celebration Brittany loved to create. Perfectly planned, perfectly presented, perfectly controlled. I carried no folder when I walked inside. The evidence remained safely in my car. I wanted to observe first. Brittany greeted guests near the entrance, smiling brightly as she moved from conversation to conversation. When she saw me, her expression flickered for the briefest moment before settling into practiced warmth. "Margaret, I am so glad you made it." "I would not miss Ethan's birthday," I replied. Throughout the evening, I watched quietly. Friends congratulated Ethan. Neighbors shared stories. Coworkers praised his generosity and character. Again and again, I heard familiar themes repeated in different forms. Family, sacrifice, responsibility, support. The narrative Brittany had built over the years was everywhere, woven so naturally into conversation that most people probably no longer questioned it. As dinner ended, Brittany tapped a spoon against her glass. The room gradually fell silent. "Before dessert," she announced, "I would like to say a few words about Ethan." Applause followed. Ethan smiled modestly. Brittany spoke beautifully. She praised his work ethic, his kindness, and his commitment to family. Then she arrived exactly where I knew she would. "Many people do not realize how much Ethan has quietly done for others over the years," she said. Several guests nodded knowingly, especially when it comes to supporting family members through difficult circumstances. I noticed Daniel standing near the back of the room. Rebecca was there too. So was Lily. None of them looked surprised. Brittany continued speaking. "He has always put family first, even when it required personal sacrifice." More applause followed. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan stood and raised his glass. "Actually," he said, smiling toward me, "if we are talking about family sacrifices, we should probably recognize Mom. Everything I achieved started with her." The room turned toward me. Brittany's smile froze slightly. I slowly stood. "Thank you, Ethan," I said. "That is very kind. There is something I would like to share as well." I walked calmly to my car and returned carrying the folder. No dramatic gestures. No raised voice. Just quiet certainty. Back inside, I placed the folder on a nearby table. Over the past few weeks, I learned that many people believe Ethan has been financially supporting me for years. Murmurs spread through the room. Several guests exchanged glances. Brittany's expression tightened. "That is not true," I continued. "I have supported myself since my husband's passing. My home is paid for. My finances are stable. They always have been." Silence settled over the gathering. I removed several documents. Property records, tax statements, community publications, public posts. Nothing sensational, just facts. I calmly explained how assumptions had been encouraged, repeated, and allowed to spread. Then I shared something else. I also learned that these stories became useful. The room remained silent. Useful for building a reputation. Useful for earning admiration. Useful for creating the image of extraordinary sacrifice where none existed. Several people lowered their eyes. Rebecca finally stepped forward. Her voice was steady. Everything Margaret is saying is true. The room shifted instantly. The confirmation carried weight because it came from someone who had once been close to Brittany. A neighbor spoke next. I remember hearing those stories. Another guest nodded. I did too. One by one, people began acknowledging what they had believed. Not because they were malicious, but because they trusted the source. Ethan looked completely stunned. He turned toward Brittany. Did you tell people Mom depended on us? Brittany opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. I never exactly said that. The answer itself became an admission. Nobody argued. Nobody interrupted. The silence did all the work. For the first time all evening, Brittany was not controlling the narrative. She was trapped inside it. Ethan looked away from her and sat down heavily. The disappointment on his face said more than any confrontation could have. Several guests quietly approached me. Some apologized. Some admitted they had never questioned what they were told. Others simply thanked me for clarifying the truth. The atmosphere of the party had changed completely. Not because I had humiliated anyone. Because reality had finally entered the room. I gathered my papers and closed the folder. I did not come here for revenge, I said. I came because truth matters. And because every person deserves to be known for who they are, not for a story someone else created. Then I wished Ethan a happy birthday. As I walked toward the door, Lily hugged me tightly. Daniel nodded from across the room. Rebecca offered a small smile. Outside, the evening air felt cool and peaceful. Behind me, difficult conversations were beginning. Trust would need to be rebuilt. Relationships would have to find new footing. But those were no longer burdens I needed to carry. The woman who had walked into that dinner weeks ago and quietly endured a cruel joke was gone. In her place stood someone who no longer needed approval, validation, or apologies. The greatest consequence was not that Brittany lost credibility that night. It was that she lost control of a story she had spent years creating. And as I drove home beneath the glow of the streetlights, I realized something that brought me more peace than any apology ever could. The truth had finally introduced itself, and it did not need my help to be believed.